going to go ahead and get started. And first thing we want to do is I want Representative Johnson to, he's asked for a point of personal privilege to introduce a couple of his friends.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If they would stand, Landon and Alonzo Cavanos, they are students from my school, Baser Linwood High School. One of them actually took my classes. Please do not ask, as others have stories about me, and they served as pages. I'm so thankful that program's back in the building. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I'm happy that they've returned the program this year as well. It's nice to see this morning. Okay, next up, do we have any requests for bill introductions? Yes. Rachel Monger.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I am Rachel Monger with Leading Age Kansas, and we are requesting introduction of a bill concerning regulation of supplemental nursing service agencies, and the number is RS 2672. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions regarding that? Is there any objection to its introduction? Okay, without objection, the bill will be, we will request the introduction. Okay, so we're going to jump into the agenda. We're having a presentation by Sharday Kane from LRDS. I'm sorry, I've got a little brain fog today. And she's going to share with us the work that was done this year on the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight, which, as you recall, we passed the bill to organize that last year. So welcome to committee, Sharday.
Thank you. Oh, it's on already. Okay. My name is Sharday Kane. As Madam Chair just said, I am a fiscal analyst for the Kansas Legislative Research Department. This is my second year with the department, and one of my budgets is the Department for Children and Families, so I help staff the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight, and I am excited to be here today to present the report to you. So if you have it in front of you, then I'm going to work through the recommendations that are on pages 3 and 4. There were 15 recommendations in total, and in addition to that, 3 proposed bills that the committee voted on at the last committee meeting. The first recommendation was to have the courts providing biological parents and other family members or kin who attend court for the first time with a document outlining requirements to accomplish reintegration or regain custody of their children. So literally, if you leave court, then just give them a paper outlining what the judge said and what they need to do to regain custody of their children. The second recommendation was for the Department for Children and Families to place more emphasis during mental and physical training on the foster program as opposed to the foster to adopt program. The third recommendation was the court-appointed special advocate program should maintain the $225,000 funding for fiscal year 2023 and following years. And that more information on that recommendation is on page 11. The CASA State Director explained that the CASA is staffed by trained volunteers who work with courts, child welfare agencies, and families who enter into the child welfare system. The State Director stated CASA volunteers speak on behalf of children in custody of the state and the child's best interest. And that funding comes from the Children Initiatives Fund, so she also expressed consideration for having that funding and needing it to continue the program. The next 2 recommendations are based on testimony that the committee heard from a former foster youth who shared her experience in foster care. They stated they were often overlooked and didn't have many opportunities for bonding with their foster family. So one of their recommendations that the committee agreed with was having more opportunities for bonding at all ages, not just for young children, but for children of all ages. And then also expressed having information about the foster child from the child's perspective placed in their placement books, also known as red, blue, or orange books, because when some foster children go from family to family, then they don't want to share their story over and over again. So having some of that information already available to the new parents. The next recommendation was regarding the Juvenile Justice Improvement Fund and having $21 million transferred back in for evidence-based intervention programs addressed in 2016 SB 367 to aid community programs serving the needs of juveniles in the justice system. The assistant revisor who discussed this said that this bill made significant changes to the juvenile justice system and set case length and probation length limits, as well as other changes to the level of offense for children. And that funding will be used for that. The next one, or the next few, are related to caseworker caseloads and having a statutory cap. The next one is requesting for proposal being a federal grant awarding process into a performance-based federal grant awarding process, and then prioritizing increasing support to kinship-placed children and affording them the same services as children placed in a licensed foster home. And the last one on that page is regarding the best interest staffing process. DCF provided an overview of that process to the committee, and more information on that can be found on page 13. On page 4, the governor should rescind Executive Order 2128, and further, the governor and legislature should collaborate to reach a consensus on a bill during the 2022 legislative session that would establish a true, independent, and transparent Office of the Child Advocate. And more information on those two recommendations can be found on page 5 and 6, as well as on page 14. The revisers provided a review of the House bill, the Senate bill, and the executive order, and where they were in agreement and where the changes were between the three. The next one is related to communication and relationship between DCF and legislators. And the last two recommendations were regarding the Child Death Review Board. Information on that can be found on page 10, as well as the last proposed legislation at the bottom of page 4. So the chairperson of the Child Death Review Board provided an overview of the board's function, which is to review all deaths of Kansas children from birth to 18 years of age. And she clarified that there was some concerns regarding confidentiality and the local review boards, so trying to make that statutorily correct, and also providing rules and regulations for that communication. The other two proposed legislations are related to Adrian's Law, so expanding it to require visual pediatric physician examination from a pediatrician with specialized training for examining alleged abused and neglected children. So that's a two-pronged program. The first would be to create a pilot program to help start training pediatricians, and then phase 2 would be to develop a statewide network of safe care providers who would be able to participate in education programming. And then the last proposed legislation was regarding interpretation of statutory language, and that recommendation or law would be for DCF and law enforcement to determine how the statutory language needs to change to allow for more transparency between the two agencies. And that is a review of the conclusions and recommendations for the joint committee, and I'm happy to stand for questions.
Okay, committee, do we have questions regarding the report? Thank you. Whoop, we do. Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could, a question. The question about the amending Adrian's Law, I remember it, of course, from last year that it was to require a visual on any sort of abused child case. But this is to require a pediatric physician examination. So so the child would literally have to come to the doctor's office. Is that what this is? Or you're not going to send pediatricians out in the field somehow? Do you know the import of this? I mean, I'm a little.
Yes, I would say that it would be, they would go to the pediatrician's office for that review or evaluation after law enforcement and/or DCF determines that that should be done.
Okay, so, all right, thank you.
Representative Helmer.
Yes, I just want to make a statement that in reading this, we got this at 10:45, and I've been in meetings ever since, so I haven't been able to saturate it. And I've had 2 phone calls from my area that my OA said the phones really lit up with concern. So I want to talk to my foster care parents about this. It's really brought up some concern. So I just wanted to make that statement. And I don't know what it is, but I think maybe I'd really like to converse with them about what's going on. And I think that might be it, that pediatrician part. Thank you.
Okay, these are just the recommendations, though. This is not in bill form now, so I'm a little surprised about how people at home are. Representative Esau.
Which that leads to a question I have, and I realize if it's in draft that no one has an answer, but have any of the 3 that were proposed legislation, have any of them been introduced in bill form yet that we know of? I don't think so. I haven't been keeping up with it.
Not that I know of, and I don't believe so. I think it would have come through here. Yeah, you know, during the committee, let's see, the 3 of us sit on that committee, and during that committee, I'll just share with you now, I expressed some concern, not the day of the recommendations, because I had to attend virtually, but when we were having the testimony about it, I expressed concerns about, you know, not every community has a pediatrician. The rural areas don't. But this is allowing for the training and education on how to recognize it. The problem is you can't force that down their throat either for your physicians that you do have in the community. It's up to them to decide whether they want to go get that training or not. So just wanted to add that part of the discussion. Let's see, I saw another. Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The very first recommendation about providing biological parents and other family members with a document outlining requirements, you know, to accomplish reintegration or regain custody. Would this be a generic document, or it would be sort of custom tailored to their particular situation as to why the child, you know, was pulled from the family? Do you know? I mean, I think it's a great idea. I'm just wondering if it really is specific. Was that maybe? Do you know?
Madam Chair, I don't believe that the committee got that detailed in their recommendation, so I do not know if they had that in mind. Which one?
I mean, my comment is just, I have heard from people who were it was very frustrating to them because they didn't know exactly what they needed to do to get custody back. And I think this sounds like a great idea, you know, as long as it's sort of specific to the case of that particular child.
Representative Esau.
As I recall from what was being said and the concerns that were coming up on that one, there was at least one court or county that parents were leaving. They weren't given any specific instructions, and because of turnover of staff, they were often lost about what they were supposed to do next, and there wasn't consistency. And so whoever was bringing up the concern wanted us to have something that was consistent across the state so parents knew what the expectations were so they could meet them or be shown that they didn't meet them.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Kane, for being here today. I just wanted to ask you one quick question. The ranking member and the leadership they've done a very good job last session prior to our advance to this committee, taking care of and establishing that office of the child advocate. I see that bullet up there. I would like a little bit more of insight for what is the proposal that actually establishes a true independent and transparent OCA. What exactly does that mean? What recommendations do you have in that lane?
Madam Chair, I do not have any specific recommendations, and the Joint Committee did not really go into detail on what that should look like, just that it should be a collaborative effort between all parties.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, thank you, Sade. Good job. Okay, next up we have Secretary Howard is here today to talk from DCF to talk to us about foster care system. Welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's great to see all of you. I think this is my first testimony in the 2022 session, so glad to be here. You know, I'm always glad to talk about what's going on in the foster care system and the broader child welfare system. I'm really proud of a lot of the work that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years. There's more to do. You'll hear both those pieces in my discussions with you today. Maybe just a context piece before I dive into the presentation. I always like to think about the context. When I came into this role 3 years ago, I thought about the system as having, you know, a very much of a framework focused just on child protection. Child protection is very important, but it's not all that we should be focused on. Very few resources around prevention in the state to really prevent youth from going into foster care. Obviously, lots of challenges with regard to stability, kids just moving around too much, not having permanent placements, lack of supports around behavioral health. And when I think about the system that we're trying to transform towards, and the governor spoke to this in her State of the State message, I'm really talking about a child and family well-being system, a system that has, you know, robust resources for prevention to support families at the earliest stage possible to prevent youth from coming into care, and a state that focuses more on relatives and kin first and thinking about the resources and supports that relatives and kin might need to help keep youth safe. There's lots of other pieces, and I'll refer back to this at the end, but I think that the context of that journey is kind of important because I think it's important not to look narrowly just at the foster care system, but the broader context of the child welfare system. So we're going to dig in today. You'll get some pieces that give you a few nuts and bolts about foster care, a lot of pieces about how we're doing, what progress looks like. Some pieces about performance. How do we measure performance when we're a state that has a public-private partnership, a privatized system of child welfare and case management. So we'll work through that, and I'll also share some pieces at the end, again, just kind of about those foundational changes that we're trying to accomplish. You know, on slide 3, you know, how's it going? I really wanted to start out by talking about, as we sit here today, what's the need for foster care in the state of Kansas? As of January 1, there were 6,574 youth in foster care. Actually, today, there's 6,517. That's been a 13% reduction since 2019. And you can see as you look at this chart that this is the lowest number of youth since we actually go back. You don't even see it on this chart, actually to a point back in 2016. One of the things I always feel like I have to do first is to give a great big thank you to the legislature for how willing you were to kind of take the plunge on families first and say, we are a state that wants to embrace prevention. That's not the only reason the numbers have fallen, but it's a significant reason that we have fewer youth entering foster care because they're getting those upfront prevention supports. So that's kind of a first piece by the numbers. As we delve in a little bit to the process as it relates to foster care, just a reminder that, only law enforcement and the court can remove a child from the parent's custody. DCF doesn't have the authority on its own to do that. We do receive reports during our assessment phase, where we're looking in terms of those prevention services, we're looking at what options there might be to keep the child safe. There are times where the safest decision is for a child to go into foster care. And in those cases, we recommend to the county or district attorney to file a child in need of care petition. And again, there's a lot of activities that happen before that takes place. We implemented a process about 1.5 years ago called team decision making, which has been really, really powerful in bringing people who care about that child around the table. Other family members, could be people in the community that the child has a relationship, and have those really upfront, candid conversations. What is the best way to ensure that this child is safe? But again, sometimes the safest decision at that point in time is for a child to go into foster care. I wanted to dig into those numbers a little bit about foster care, and on slide 5, I gave you the total number of youth in care. What I show you on slide 5 is how many children are actually entering foster care in a given year. So last year, we had just over 3,000 youth enter foster care. We've had about a 10% reduction in youth entering care each of the last 2 years. So again, I credit that so much to prevention, and I'll divert to that just for a moment because I think it's so critical as we think about our path forward in creating a child and family well-being system. On slide 6, we mentioned a few pieces, a few steps taken to enhance and augment prevention. This state has had family preservation services since 1997, kind of the same year that privatization of child welfare first began. There were some services before that in some counties, but statewide family preservation happened then, but fairly limited resources. That was really the only prevention resource. But in the last 3 years, you've approved additional funding for family preservation services, and then you also, of course, approved funding and legislation to allow Kansas to be one of the very first states to implement the federal Family First program, which was really the first time that the federal government stepped forward and said, gosh, states, we really do think it's a good thing to try to keep kids out of foster care, so we'll let you use some foster care dollars to do that. So the Family First prevention services. A few other things we've done I think are also relevant in the last couple years around mental health supports. Last October, just 4 months ago, I guess now, we implemented mobile youth crisis called the Kansas Family Crisis Response System. There is now an 800 number for families to call. This isn't just kids in foster care. This is any family in Kansas that's having a crisis with the youth. Sometimes that can get resolved over the phone with trained counselors. Sometimes there needs to be a mobile response when there's an urgent or imminent need to the child's home, to their child's foster home. And so we're really excited about that. It's early yet in terms of data, but I think, certainly states that have had that in place for more years than Kansas see huge impacts from that in terms of helping to meet the needs of youth who are really, and their families who just maybe can't manage a specific imminent crisis that might be going on, typically, from the behavioral health perspective. On page 7, I give you just some outcomes on Family First, because, I could do a whole presentation on it, but I'll stop after this slide. 89% of the children and youth who have reached 12 months from the time that they were referred to Family First services have remained home without the need for foster care. That's more than 1,000 children. And only 0.1% have actually been placed in foster care during the time that a Family First case was open. So again, very successful. And again, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Family First, under the federal law, we're able to fund services around mental health, substance use, parent education, and then what we call kinship navigation, kind of helping maybe families, relatives with maybe some legal pieces if they're looking to try to support and take care of youth. So again, really excited about that. Very excited that the governor has recommended in her budget an expansion of that program by $7 million, all funds, $3.5 million state general fund, which would expand that by 50%. There are places in the state where we have waiting lists where kids can't get into that because we don't have resources, particularly on the mental health side of that. So. All right, so maybe back a little bit then to foster care. I talked about the number of youth entering care. And on page 8, there's a lot of data here. I'll just highlight a couple of things. In the last fiscal year, in terms of what led youth to come into foster care, about 3/4 of youth came into care by reasons of abuse or neglect, but there are about 1/4 who came in for what under our Kansas statutes are called families in need of assessment. That might be a circumstance where maybe a family is challenged to deal with something going on with their youth. They just can't manage at that point in time. Could be truancy. We don't get a lot for truancy, but those are the kinds of categories. And the most frequent reason altogether for removal is related to neglect. On page 9, maybe the last slide related to kind of the need for foster care. I've given you the total numbers in foster care. I've given you the entries into foster care. What slide 9 does is tell you the entries and exits from foster care. And you can see that in the last 2 state fiscal years, we've had more children leaving the system than entering the system. So obviously that impacts the total number of youth in care. So again, exits have exceeded entries of youth leaving foster care. Most children in foster care go back home to their parents. Reintegration is what's most common, about 54%. But there's a portion of youth who can't go home. And for those youth, that path is often adoption. So I also wanted to just give you a glimpse of some of the work around adoptions. And slide 10 lets you see the number of youth with finalized adoptions each year. About an average of about 1,000 over the last 3 years, a really large number in 2019, and then again staying around that 900, 1,000 the last couple years. Really trying to focus on timely adoptions for those youth who are in our custody. All right, just a little bit more about the court process when a child may enter foster care. So I talked about how DCF may forward an application or a petition for protective custody to the DA. Then there's a temporary custody hearing that's held within 72 hours to decide if the child should remain in their home or come into DCF custody. And then within 60 days, what's called an adjudication reunification hearing. That usually has to be within 60 days. There can be some exceptions to that. And I'll talk later about some other court hearings that happen with regard to permanency after the child is already in foster care. So I said earlier, Kansas, we're pretty unique in the country in terms of having a public-private partnership, really a privatized system where all of our case management of our foster care system is privatized through a public-private partnership. More states have been going down that path, at least for parts of their system, but this is a path that Kansas started in 1997. So it's been the focus in Kansas for about 25 years now. So right now, we have 4 case management grantees that carry out all those activities that need to happen after those youth come into care. The current entities are St. Francis Ministries, KVC Health Systems, TFI Family Services, and Cornerstones of Care. So it's really those organizations, their practitioners, their team members who are doing that work with the families, those direct services, the court reports, the case planning, working with community resources to ensure the appropriate services are available. And I've given you a map on page 13 where you can see within what we call our 8 catchment areas, which areas are served by each of the 4 case management agencies. And some of them have more than one catchment area. A little more about the case planning process on page 14. Really getting into the whole context of placement decisions. I talked about the fact that, more than half of youth are reunified with their parents. But a case plan goal has to be set for the child. Reunification, adoption, or an alternative, which the last bullet says OPPLA. What that really means is an other planned permanent living arrangement. I think frankly in the generic vernacular, we're talking typically about older youth who may age out of the system or who were trying to find a transition to adulthood and permanency. So again, in Kansas, about 54% reunified, 35% adoption, about 8% have that case plan of the OPPLA. Just a couple additional slides. I won't spend a lot of time on slide 15. Just a few additional services that our case management partners provide. Lots of initial and ongoing screens. For example, trauma assessment, some mental health screens as youth come into care. And then you can see kind of that whole list of items, including coordination and referral to services like mental health, and increasingly an awful lot of work in coordination with the state's managed care organizations through the Medicaid program. And the goal really of all these services is, what does this child need in order to reach permanency in the shortest amount of time? You may have heard that language, permanency in child time. A child's time is not the same as our time. When you think about, a child in care and the proportion of their life that they may be in care. So again, a bit about the services that our contractors provide. In terms of foster care placements themselves, as I said, we're increasingly focused and have a goal towards increasing the percentage of youth who are placed with relatives or other kin who have a relationship with that child. But we also have a whole array of placements, from family foster homes to some residential facilities, qualified residential treatment programs. There's one secure facility in the state that's typically used for youth running when doesn't seem to be a different option. But But when we reimburse at different rates, again, based on the child's level of care and their needs. So those kinds of assessments are done about what does this child need? And again, we have a great array of rates there on page 17. As I said earlier, increasing focus on relative placement in fiscal year 21. 51% of youth were in family foster homes. 35% were with a relative, 8% in group or residential care. And if we count, people that we might call kin, someone who is familiar to the child, but maybe not a blood relative, we have 42% of children placed there. That's up from 33% a couple of years ago. Our goal is to reach 50% of placements with relative or other kin, up from that 42% where we sit today. On slide 18, you can see a graphic that talks about the number of foster homes per county. DCF does do the licensing and regulation around family foster homes as well as the other levels of care. I didn't put much in here about licensing. We could certainly talk about that if you wanted to, but I thought it would be useful just to see a map. We always get the question, do you have enough foster homes? And I think the answer, of course, is always no. We do have a strong capacity in Kansas, but we see some gaps, and those gaps tend to be around homes that can serve large sibling groups, homes willing to serve teens, and then, of course, those youth with special needs. So part of the work that we've been doing in recent times, the last few months, is really trying to think about how do we expand our array of services and supports even further. How do we make sure that foster families have the support they need, that relatives have the support they need, and do we need some new things within our array of services? On slide 20, I referenced this in a little bit more detailed way, but DCF and KDADS are together researching the possibilities of what might be called treatment foster homes or professional foster home models, where you might actually have someone in that home who might actually themselves be like a licensed behavioral health professional. A number of states have these models where basically those folks are providing the level of support that youth might otherwise get in a residential type setting. So again, we're researching that model now. What might it mean to have that be in our array of services in Kansas? We're also continuing to work, just again with that focus on family-based care. There's lots of research and study about the benefits of being in a family-based setting as opposed to a group or residential setting. And frankly, Kansas has really, since shortly after privatization, always been fairly low on the group and residential side, but I think there are times where we think we can do better, especially for younger children. I would like to be in a place, we don't have very many, but I'd sure like to not see like youth under 12 be placed in a group setting. So again, lots of work going on there. This intersects a little bit with some of the pieces around when we talk about those youth who may not have placement stability, who may be moving around, maybe in an office because we can't find supports, really intersects with this conversation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. On slide 21, I wanted to talk about how do we assure performance within the foster care system in Kansas. And again, we as a agency that receives federal dollars from the Federal Department of Health and Human Services and the Administration on Children and Families, we're held to reaching different data performance outcomes. And there's a federal process through what's called the Children and Family Services Review that happens periodically, where there are case reads that happen and we report data on a regular basis. And if we don't meet those standards, we have to do performance improvement plans. In fact, the Kansas cycle will be coming up again in the next year. But we've really replicated some of that with our contractors. So there's 15 aggregate data performance performance outcomes. Those are mainly in the categories of safety, permanency, and child well-being. And so we have monthly data management reports. We do quarterly case reviews, case reads, really wrapping. We have an entire quality assurance team that wraps around performance management related to those outcomes. When those outcomes aren't being met, just like we as a state have to respond to that, so too do our contractors, or sometimes our own regional offices will ask them to do a performance improvement plan about how they're going to move to meet those standards. And then our contracts also allow for penalties to be applied if the performance improvement plan implementation doesn't happen or performance doesn't meet that, and certain incentives for success applied to outcomes that are met. So again, we tried to mirror what we have to do as a state with our contractors and sometimes with our own offices. I'm not going to go through all of those 15 measures, but I wanted to focus on a few on slide 22, because I think this also lets us get into the conversation about where have we made progress in the last few years and where do we still have work to do. So one of the indicators that's measured across the country has to do with maltreatment in foster care, and it's basically a federal standard that would call for 8.5 or fewer victimizations per 100,000 days in care. Of course, we don't want any, of course. Kansas has tended to do well on this measure. I mean, certainly to meet that federal standard with regard to safety while youth are in foster care. And you can see the data for the last couple years. We're also really, really proud of the work we've done on placement stability. The fourth item on this chart, the federal standard would call for no more than 4.4 moves over 1,000 days of care. As we ended last year at 5.4, 2 years ago we were at 9.9 moves. So tremendous impact in terms of placement stability for youth in foster care. We're not where we want to be yet, and frankly, few states are, but we've made great progress on that. We took a lot of steps, including, things like even just doing some innovation grants with some of our contractors to say, what youth are you really struggling with? Like one of our contractors, we gave them a small mini grant where they hired a couple of behavioral interventionists who could really go and provide services in homes where youth with serious emotional disturbance were, who tended to disrupt frequently, things like that. I mean, we've tried a lot of things, and again, not where we're not to the goal yet, but really cut almost in half in 2 years. So we're very proud of that. But I'll tell you what I think our biggest challenge in performance is right now is in the timely permanence. And you can see that on this chart. On the second row, the federal standard would say that 40.6% of youth should achieve permanency within 12 months of entering foster care. We're in the mid-30s at this point. And then if you look at just right below that, again, we're not quite there as well in terms of permanency for children in care, 12 to 23 months. Again, lower, and we fell a bit in this last fiscal year. What I can tell you is that in 101 out of 105 counties, those performance standards are being met. Those children are reaching permanency timely. They're not reaching permanency timely in 4 counties, and those are the 4 largest counties in the state. So I've got a document on the next page where you can see that. Remember that standard was 40.5%, and you can see we've got 24% in Sedgwick County, 23% in Shawnee County, 24% in Wyandotte, 30. Actually, one of these counties is wrong. I'll get that corrected for you. But in any event, I think the first one should be Johnson County. So we've been talking with the Office of Judicial Administration about this and with judges within those judicial districts. And we also have had our contractors in those regions develop formal performance improvement plans. When we think about kind of the need for foster care, obviously an important piece is our children, achieving that permanency. Are they exiting the system? So this is one of our primary focuses during this year is really understanding what those gaps might be, what those issues might be. Are they resource driven? Are there, a few years ago when adoptions weren't happening, my predecessor started a process where she funded a few staff to be like adoption accelerators, like get the paperwork moving, help the contractors, help the courts. And so we're trying to sort that out. Are there things where just a little bit of resource on maybe the paperwork side might help in one region, but what are those issues? So again, huge focus there on those 4 counties. Page 24, I think I mentioned this before, just how pleased we are with the progress on placement stability. Again, the rate at which children move. When I came into this role, I just knew if we didn't do anything else, we had to assure that youth who come into the foster care system weren't moving around at the rates that they were. They had to have some sense of stability, even before they had a permanent home or family. So again, you can see the trends back to 2016, and the focus and work that all of us, our partners, our regional offices, our case management providers have done on that. I wanted to, on page 25, I wanted to spend a little bit of data on a couple of special populations that get a lot of attention. I want to talk about those youth who are missing from placement or who run from placement, and our efforts in that regard. And I want to talk about the issue of youth, again, back to that placement stability, youth who may not have a permanent placement at night and who might have to be in an office. So the first thing I want to talk about was children missing from placement. We have in place at DCF and at our contractors what we call a special response team. And that's a statewide network that's really designed to focus on those youth who may not be in their placement because they've run, they're missing from their placement. We expanded that. It had started out with a couple of staff at DCF, I think like in 2018. We expanded that to 10 members in 2019 and then to 12 in 2020. We felt like they needed a little bit more support in the Sedgwick County area. These are non-caseload carrying positions at our case management partners in addition to the DCF staff. And their whole focus is to find those youth, but also to prevent those run behaviors, really through a lot of work around how do you engage, how do you find an anchor for those youth so they don't run. And again, there's a lot of partners in this. We have there's a large process that happens when a youth is missing from placement. There's things that have to happen, within an hour, within 2 hours. There's reports to the National Center on Missing and Exploited Children. So there's a lot of process around it, but I think what we've really concluded is the work around helping those youth with some relational support so that they feel like they have an anchor to really overcome that. So one of the things we've tried to do in the last year or so, you can see on page 26, kind of a snapshot of, at that point, this was a point, I think it was August 19th, that we do case reviews a few times a year and try to dig into what do we understand about the youth who are missing from placement at that point in time. And so this specific case review, for example, showed us that 25% of the kids, it was the first time they ran. So what would it take for them not to run again? What's that next piece? But 43% of them had 4 or more runs. That's an entirely different circumstance. So in looking at this data, we also began to look at, are there substance use needs, are there mental health needs? And one of the things that really stood out, in this data run for those youth who've run multiple times, were that a number of them had experienced either the death of a primary caregiver or the termination of the parental rights. So the trauma, the loss, the grief associated with that. So that's been really good information as we and our partners work to say, how do we wrap better relational anchors around these youth and really kind of strengthen practice around that. So we're doing a couple things around continuing to focus in this area. One is we're working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on what's a standard, kind of a standard recovery plan that really begins to look in a standard way across all of our regions about the needs and placement at the onset of the running behaviors, and then how do you pull together the collective resources that are necessary on behalf of the youth. For example, as we look at the data, which, we tend to range between 60 and 70 youth, 27 to 29 of those tend to be from one county, Sedgwick County. So we're really trying to wrap more supports and resources and understanding there. We've got a performance improvement plan going on there. But again, some specific work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and their leadership team around that recovery plan. We've also trying to pull in more youth voices. Really get the voice of youth engagement. We have a really active youth advisory panel from our foster care youth, working with them. And then we've recently had the chance to join a project through the Annie Casey Foundation that's also youth-driven, where youth are really suggesting the opportunity to think of different ways to create lifelong stability, particularly for those youth who may not reintegrate, who may not be adopted, and they've kind of called it what they've called soul family permanency, support, opportunity, unity, and then a way to make a legal relationship with an individual. So again, we've kind of joined that with a handful of other states, again, to learn a bit from youth who've had that experience in the system, many of whom themselves were runners while they were in the child welfare system. The other kind of special topic I just wanted to reference as well does have to do with the piece about failure to place a child. And this has to do with a child who may stay overnight in a case management office. This is also something that we're being measured on in terms of our settlement agreement, the foster care lawsuit that we settled a few years ago. I gave you kind of a wonky definition on page 29. It's the definition we've agreed to follow with our settlement agreement. It essentially says if a child got to the case management agency office before midnight and they didn't get placed by 6 the next morning, unless there was like an extraordinary circumstance like an ice storm or something where it wasn't safe to do that, then that's a failure to place. So basically, if they needed to sleep overnight in the office for whatever reason, it could be that a placement wasn't located, it could be that the child didn't want to go to the placement and really refused to go, which you might see maybe more with some older youth, and we're not successfully able to do that. Some data on this on page 30. We began tracking in April of 2018 kind of failure to place. And the data in the table isn't the number of kids, it's the number of instances. So, for example, if you look at the last few months, you see the numbers were really low kind of through 2021. They've actually been low the last couple months, but you'll see a couple of really high months, for example, in September and October. We had a couple of youth, just to be really honest, where our case management provider was really challenged to find placement. Lots of lots of issues around behavioral needs and/or IDD kinds of needs, really challenged to find placement. And so a very small number of children ended up with multiple nights of not being placed, with a foster family or somewhere else. And again, I should give the caveat too. I don't want people to have a picture of people like sleeping on a floor in an office building. I mean, our case management providers, they have rooms, they have beds. In some cases, that's the relationship. I'm thinking of a particular circumstance where the same case manager stayed with that child. Well, lots and lots of people tried for really multiple weeks to find the right placement for that child. DCF, KDAS, behavioral health professionals, MCOs, until one could identify that place. So again, in terms of the discrete number of youth, in the fiscal year we're in, there have been 36 children involved in those instances and a couple involved in a significant number of those instances. And that sort of takes me back to the conversation I was having earlier about really needing, some additional options within our array of services. Perhaps those professional treatment homes, those sorts of things. So again, a little bit on failure to place a child. And we do have a really robust process on that. Anytime there is a failure to place, the case management provider turns in a critical incident to us. We wrap DCF resources around that, KDAD's resources. Case managers from MCOs come around the table. You can see just lots of collaboration. I talked about that on page 32, the different folks that come around that table to try to find that stable placement for that child. We've got a couple things that are working really well in this regard. You can see on slide 33. We entered into a border agreement with the state of Missouri. Usually if you're trying to place a child out of state and the interstate compact for placement of children goes into place, and it's really difficult. But under our border agreement, within 60 miles, so you think both in the KC metro area, in the southeast Kansas area in particular, it gives a lot more options where there may be family across that border and a lot easier to do that. We also have worked hard on some partnerships with some group providers and some foster providers to assure some openings are reserved kind of around those kinds of placements and supervision. But again, we think we need to continue to increase the service array for youth who have those high needs, and we need to continue to work on partnerships to help with emergency overnight traumatic disruptions. So again, working on both those areas really hard as we continue to focus there. All right, I'm almost done talking here. We've got a couple pages about foster care payments and the budget. So for foster care, for our case management providers, the current payment structure, it's a monthly payment that's based on caseload size on the last day of the prior month. And then the actual placement costs, depend upon the array. What level of care is the child receiving, either in a family foster home or a residential home. Those are paid out directly to those providers twice a month. And then some of the costs, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, medical costs, those show up in the Medicaid budget. But foster care is a part of the consensus caseload. You can see the consensus caseload estimate for fiscal year 22 is $259 million for foster care. About $185 million of that comes from the state general fund. You can see some detailed funding on slide 36. Again, some federal dollars for eligible youth, primarily state dollars. So that's a bit of an overview of foster care, a little bit on the larger system and where we've been. I just really wanted to close talking about really where where we're trying to transform. And I said this earlier, the governor said this, really moving from a child protection system to a child and family well-being system. That also means that we need to be far more engaged with communities and community partners than perhaps we've typically been. But the goal, of course, is preventing the need for the families or others to even ever touch our system. Really getting that earliest support possible. We talk a lot about mandated reporters. You have to call the hotline, be a mandated reporter. What's it mean to have mandated supporters? And also making sure that sometimes we're not confusing some adversity or poverty related needs with neglect. And that if families need supports due to some adversity they're facing, poverty they're facing, how do we get those needs met when this is not really an issue of abuse or neglect? So we've had some great opportunities, frankly, during the pandemic to do some great partnership work. We were selected to be part of a Thriving Families cohort through the National Governors Association and Casey Family Programs. And it's really has been a model about what does it mean to make this kind of transformation. That it goes beyond, having prevention services available. It's really a whole different philosophy and model that moves back even further. And what does it mean for communities to support families? So just one example of one of the projects we have going right now on slide 39, we're working on a project with the Emporia School District where, one of the things through the Casey project that really came out, there's a lot of concern during the pandemic, right? Schools were closed, nobody's going to report abuse. Well, when states started looking at their data, of course, you find out that schools are like the biggest reporter, but that didn't necessarily mean that very many of those reports translated to youth coming into care. So an awful lot of those reports were screened out. So what this does then is say, well, gosh, that doesn't mean those families didn't need something. And that school district, they did what they thought they're supposed to do, those workers, but what does that family need? So our partnership with the Emporia School District really looks to partner families with needed services without any type of a DCF intake. Now, if there's a concern of abuse or neglect, they need to make that report to the hotline. But oftentimes, that was kind of the only path that people were thinking of. And this helps people think about a little bit of a different path. On the last slide, slide 40, again, just to sort of summarize again that future vision, that movement towards thriving families, kin first state, child and family well-being system. We really think that some of the things this does too as well is advance racial equity, remove some of the stigma families might have from seeking help earlier. Because, you don't, if you sort of think if you seek help, you're going to get reported to DCF, and strengthen the community's abilities to respond. And I gave you some examples there. We're really excited. We're doing some work with Kansas Children's Service League, who's one of our prevention partners, and we have a small contract with them where they're doing some work to try to help communities who want to develop family resource centers across the state. Again, really successful model in states where a family resource center could be attached to a school or a trusted community organization. It could have an array of different services for families. Again, kind of moving that, continuing to move upstream. So again, it's really, really important what we do in foster care when kids are in care, but it's as important what we're doing before they are anywhere close to needing our supports and services. So again, thank you. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.
Thank you. That was a great report, very thorough. Can you stand for a few questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Committee, do we have questions? I was going to say I do, but I'll let you go. Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary. I think the report shows you guys' hard work. You mentioned the Emporia pilot program. You didn't mention the Wichita or the Sedgwick County pilot program. How is that going with law enforcement?
Yeah, Yeah, actually, that's a great, thank you for bringing that up. It kind of fits even with the Joint Committee's recommendation related to some of the issues around sharing information. About 2.5 years ago, we entered into an agreement with the Sedgwick County Sheriff and the Wichita Police Department, two different facets to it. One was just sharing of information. So we basically allowed their dispatchers to have access to certain information around children and families. It was kind of that concept. I remember talking to Sheriff Easter, from Sedgwick County, and he's kind of like, you got some young officers going to a site, they may not even know if there are children that live at that home or if there's been issues around that. They may not go in the home and they might not identify something. So first was really that sharing of information. That piece has gone very well. The second piece has also gone very well. What we did as well is we funded I think 2 staff with the Wichita Police Department and 1 with the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office. Social workers or that type of a professional counselor type positions that could go out with the police or be a support to those police officers when they were dealing with a family situation. Not quite the same as like those CIT models you've heard about in mental health where you've got a trained professional to de-escalate a situation, but a person who can really serve to try to say, what might these families need? How do we broker those resources? Very good outcomes. In fact, they were just reaching out and asking us if we're going to keep that going for another year, and we said yes. So again, very, very pleased with that program.
Thank you for the update. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions? Representative Helmer.
Yes, you mentioned the mental health program. I'm really interested in that. I'm a retired teacher from Wichita, and you probably know, but I'm really interested in that, and so I'd like you to speak a little bit about that. And also, I'd like you to kind of expound about how many, what's going on with the number of children. I don't know how to say this with the number of disabled children that you allow in a family. We were experiencing some problems with that in USD 259 when I was there, as you know. So we were encouraging some programs. And so that goes right along with encouraging mental health programs. So please.
Well, I mean, obviously, the first thing I might mention isn't even in the KDAD's budget, right? The Mental Health in Schools program, which the legislature has funded and supported. I really like that program, well, for lots of reasons. Obviously, when I sit here with my DCF hat, that is a great support for foster youth who are part of that program. I think the governor's also supporting a $3 million enhancement of that program, recommending that in her budget to continue to expand the number of school districts who have that mental health in schools program. So that's very valuable because it's a connection primarily through mental health centers. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but it really provides support during the school day. It makes that connection to families. The second thing I might just expound on a little bit, and the piece that, one of the pieces that I alluded to earlier, that we issued an RFP about a year ago. Again, thank you to the legislature for funding this. To do mobile youth crisis. There were some legislators who actually traveled, I think, to New York a few years ago and looked at their mobile youth crisis program. But I mean, essentially, the model, it has to do with how do you support families when they're having a crisis with their child? That could be a biological family, that could be in a foster home, it could be a lot of different circumstances. So we contracted that out to Beacon Health Solutions, and they use community mental health centers and other providers. But essentially, that's a combination of both what you'd think of as a helpline, along with direct on-site support in people's homes if there's an urgent situation. So we have these performance standards that you have to be able to get to the home within an hour to 2 hours based on the urgency of the situation. Sometimes there doesn't need to be that kind of response, and it can be resolved over the phone. But again, I'd be happy to share, to provide the committee with the data that we have over the first 3 or 4 months of that program. But again, I think a huge resource to help families, sometimes not just because of that immediate response, but because then a family who may not have been connected to services can then learn about what other supports and services they might be able to garner to help with the situation that they might be facing. You know, one other thing that you triggered me to think about too as well, Representative Helmer, is the issue of youth with disabilities. And I think one of the areas where we continue to have gaps in Kansas has to do with services for youth with autism, shortage of the applied behavior analysts across the state. And I asked, I kind of commissioned kind of a task force on autism, asked Kansas Health Institute to support that. And I should be getting a final report by the 31st of this month that we'll then want to come and share with the legislature. It's an issue that's far bigger than foster care, but we were seeing its impact in the foster care system as well. So, yeah.
Representative Penn.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. And once again, you've wowed us. A quick question concerning the becoming a kin first state. I'm sorry I had to step out. I had a little cough, and in today's world, if you cough, that's a bad thing. So forgive me. But when you were talking about being a kin first state, what is your read on the amount of support that we're getting across the state for good placement for kin first? And the second part of the question is in relation to the CASA program. I'm supposing that here with the foster care system, it dovetails or overlaps. Are you seeing good support across the state for the CASA program as well? How do we handle those drops if we don't have good family placements there, if we don't have CASA support as well?
You know, I would say, Representative, I mean, kin first is, I mean, it's a work in progress. And one of the things that we certainly recognized, and I think Rachel Marsh is in the room, is that we needed to have more supports for kin families. So one of the things we've done is we asked Children's Alliance to develop some additional resourcing and training, and they've done a really great job with that. I think that's really critical. I think we still need to think about how we resource those families. You know, we had certainly made some adjustments to payments and those sorts of things, but how do you support those families overall? So again, we're doing well across the state, but we do see, if we look at our data, you know, I said we wanted to get to 50%, and we're at 42% now. If I look at data by region, I certainly will see differences. I mean, you know, Southeast Kansas looks really great. I think Northwest Kansas looks pretty good. But we do have some areas where we have gaps, and we have some more work to do. Yeah.
Representative Wagoner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Secretary. I'm wondering, you hear a lot about sort of the epic drop in the mental health state of young people in Kansas and other states. I mean, partly COVID and the whole pandemic thing. Has that, I don't really see it per se in the numbers. Is that not affecting the foster care system, or is that something that's causing trouble?
I would say a couple things there as it relates to foster care. We have not seen like significant increases in terms of youth coming into care, but I think our foster youth, like other youth, we are seeing more youth challenged, and some of the youth that, you know, I've talked about where we've struggled with stable placements or some of the youth on the run. We're definitely seeing challenges on the behavioral health side, but no, we've not seen that lead to greater entry into care. With my KDAD's hat, certainly I would say, an awful lot of work going on there through the behavioral health system, but also more work we need to do as it relates to issues around suicide prevention for youth. And I keep plugging the governor's budget. I was really pleased to see the governor put in about $1.5 million to be able to fund, some of the work that coalitions across the state are trying to do, very community focused around suicide prevention. Not a lot of resources because you often don't need a lot, but to do those projects you're trying to do in the community to address that. So again, a very, very real issue. I can't tag, specific impacts in terms of youth coming into care, but certainly see those instances of those challenges for youth in care just like other youth.
Other questions? I've got a question. So in the counseling and the behavioral health counselors in the school program has had a lot of positive and good feedback. I am wondering about especially the communities that don't have that. What kind of process do they go through to get to access mental health services, and do we have them available as often as we need?
I think, as you know, Representative Kincannon, the state's behavioral health system is experiencing the same kinds of workforce challenges that so many systems are facing right now. So the process, under our contracts with our case management providers, there are mental health assessments that are done. Under the terms of our settlement agreement, we've agreed to have there not be any delay in access to needed services. We put some clear standards in on the KDAD side into the community mental health center contracts that sort of establish the timeframes by which youth in foster care need to be able to access services from the CMHCs. I'm eager to see some of that data as we do some case reads and things like that. Our child welfare case reads that we do would show that we're meeting that, but I know from talking to my case management providers that in many cases, or some of the child placing agencies, that in many cases they are experiencing delays in being able to access those supports from the community mental health centers. And again, I think the workforce issues that are going on across across the state on the mental health workforce, the direct service worker workforce, long-term care workforce. So we're in a sort of a unique moment, but we certainly have the standards and processes in place to do that. And again, our data doesn't show that we're failing, but I certainly hear reports that access is delayed in certain jurisdictions due to lack of staffing.
Yeah, that seemed like an obvious one to me, but I wanted to hear what you had to say. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you for coming, and
thank you.
Appreciate the full report. So that's all we have on the agenda today. So we will see you tomorrow, where we're going to discuss what do we have tomorrow? Oh, nutrition's tomorrow. Just yeah. Bring healthy snacks.